So we're going to start working on this goal where we're looking at differences between poems in particular. Of course, we can recognize that poems use a different structure. We've learned that they're arranged in lines and stanzas versus paragraphs and sentences. Now we want to look at some common structural elements of poems in particular and how we can refer to these elements in a poem when we're talking about how they are different. So let's get started. So one of the first lessons that we did in our comprehension notebooks back in 3rd grade was we worked with elements of poetry. And I gave you some of these terms. We talked about different types of figurative language. I know that we've thought about making images. And what's great about poems is poems often do this for us. They invoke this sense of being able to actually feel like we're drawn in. Rhyme and the sound when we read a poem is also pretty important here. Now, here's something that's interesting for you to take a look at. Some poems do have patterns, and we know that they rhyme. We have the idea of a couplet where 2 rhyming lines are together, or even a triplet where there might be 3 rhyming lines in a sequence. So one of the first things I want to ask you to do is take a look at the 2 poems that I gave you. I gave you the Sentinel's Creed and then I also gave you the Vigil. One of those 2 poems has rhyming couplets. Pause now and see if you can figure out which one has rhyming couplets. I also had you add this information into your notebook. Personification being a specific type of figurative language that's fun to work with. The idea of assonance and consonance are advanced concepts, and I'm not going to go into these, but it might be something fun for you to explore independently. We are, however, going to take a look at the idea of a rhythm when we get a pattern that's being creative. And one of these 2 poems in particular has some strong and weak syllables in it. You've learned about syllabication, and so we're going to take a look at which poem has rhythm to it. It's kind of like it has a beat. I believe I even talked to you about how I feel like I bounce when I read it or say it. This is going to get us moving into an idea of metrical form. Pause for a second and make sure you can identify which poem you think might have some rhythm. Now, these are some other elements that you can be aware of. Alliteration and onomatopoeia both being examples of different types of figurative language. We won't get into that with the poems, the Sentinel's Creed or Vigil. We will perhaps look for a little bit of repetition, and particularly as we think about the line breaks. One of the 2 poems is written in a structure that is very open. We call that free verse. That free verse format then has some interesting ways that groups of words or ideas are put together. So that's something also that we can explore. Now looking at the 2 poems side by side, it is clear that the Sentinel's Creed is our free verse poem. And it's very clear that the Vigil is our poem arranged in clear, distinct lines and stanzas. But it is also the poem that has these rhyming couplets. So those are 2 ways that we can compare these poems. We've already identified the idea of the my and the I here, making this poem being set in a first-person point of view. And then over here in the Vigil, because we're referring to a he and his, then we know that this one is written in a third person point of view. Those are some pretty easy comparisons that we can make just on the surface. Now, if we think about examining the elements in the poem, those things that I just pointed out, we can also go back to noting that, yes, we have one that's in free verse and stanzas, but here's where our focus is going to go now. One of the poems in particular has what we call meter. It's kind of like a measurement in that it measures beats. I'm going to explain what that means. In order for us to consider the idea of meter, we have to look at the idea of syllabication, or look at the syllables. So if I take a look at this first line, I have, in measured steps he makes in rounds. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 syllables. So this first line has 8 syllables. But here's where the beat comes in. You notice how when I say each word, or when I read each syllable, it's like I put a little more stress or emphasis on it. In measured steps, he makes in rounds. So what I've done here is I've identified what we might call a stressed syllable, or it is said with a little more emphasis. Now if I take a look at these pairs, I have a stressed on stressed, a stressed on stressed syllable, a stressed on stressed syllable, and a stressed on stressed syllable. So each one of these is kind of like saying, oh, here's a poetic foot. So how many feet are in this first one? It has 4 feet. Or the meter, in this case, with the beats, 4 beats. So we could say it has a tetrameter. Now keep in mind that this is an extremely advanced concept, but it's one that it's fun for us to explore. What we can do now is we can take a look at some of the other lines and see how they compare. So let's say that I look at the first line in the first stanza. Now I'm going to come down to the first line in the second stanza. He responds not to the I missed one. This is tricky for me too. Visitor's stare. So I have that pattern of that stressed and unstressed again. And this time, if I measure out these poetic feet, what do I get? I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so this time I could say it's a pentameter. So just an idea for us to play with as we're looking at the idea of how many syllables and then how many syllable pairs that we have. And so for these pairs, again, it's what we call an unstressed and a stressed syllable. As you play with this idea, sometimes you might find that a stressed syllable comes first and then an unstressed. So I challenge you now to take a look at some of the other lines in this poem and see if you can figure out perhaps what the meter might be. And so now here is the challenge I'm giving you. In order to meet our goal of being able to compare the structure and the elements in 2 different poems, I'd like you to compare these poems in at least 3 different ways using some of the information that I just gave you. You can compare the idea of how one has meter versus that free verse idea. You can compare the idea of their point of view. You can compare how they're arranged. You can look for figurative language. I'd like to see you make some notes on 3 ways that you can compare these two poems using structural elements or some of the obvious differences. They're both poems, but they're both very different.